Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for our 2025 Latin America forecast. My name is Abel Delgado. I'm the Digital Marketing Director for America's Market Intelligence, and I'm going to be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. So before we get started, we want to give you a quick overview of what to expect. Our presentation usually lasts around 50 minutes or so, during that time, though, you can ask questions at any point in time you like. If you look at your basically your control panel as an attendee, you'll see an icon on there that says Q&A. If you click on that, it'll bring up a window and you can write in your question and send it to us, and we'll address as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Sometimes, if there's time and it works with the presentation flow, we address them during, but most of the time we do them at the end. We also stay on late for this particular webinar to answer all the questions that are posed. So if you can stay with us and want to hear those answers and questions, that's perfectly fine. If not, that's fine as well. But I just want to let you know that's something that we do with our particular 2025 or yearly annual forecast that we do for Latin America. Now, one question that we always get all the time that's constantly posed to us is, are you going to send us the materials after? And I guess for some reason, other companies don't do that, but we do. So within a couple of days, you should expect the presentation that you're seeing here today now on screen, usually in PDF form, and also a link to the edited webinar video. So you'll be able to see all of the discussion there, edited in a way that you can just follow it easily. And that should take care of that. Alrighty, so I think that covers some of the basics there. Let's move on to our legal notice here. I'm not going to read this because it's just going to take away from the time we want to devote to the actual presentation. But if you look at it, it basically talks about our liability with some of the information that's being presented here, especially information from third parties. So take a look at that at your leisure, and you'll understand sort of how that sort of thing works. Now, I'm going to turn the floor over to John Price, the Managing Director of AMI, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about both of our companies. As you can see, that we have AMI and PCMI because it's a co-presentation today. Both companies are being represented. He's going to explain a little bit about that, and then we're going to go into the actual presentation. John.
Thanks so much, Abel, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Several of you have come back from previous years. We appreciate that. Once again, we have a wildly ambitious presentation to make to you. It's going to comprise of two parts. The first part will be an overview of the economic and political situation in Latin America. And then we're going to delve into, I think, a more actionable and interesting area of analysis where we look at 5 trends and we analyze them from the point of view of our different practices. As Abel pointed out, I lead AMI, and AMI, both in its existence over the last 13 years, as well as its predecessor company, Info Americas, that dates back over 30 years, has really been in the business of helping companies make decisions. And we do that by drawing information from the customer's perspective, the competitor's perspective, and the business context or environment in which they operate. And we help them make key decisions, important decisions, whether they're on an annual basis or longer-term decisions, as well as particular events like transactions and acquisitions and sales and divestments. Some of the key questions that we help answer some of those decisions you'll see on the right here listed. Joining me today from AMI is Diego Rodriguez, who runs our logistics and our industrial practice. But we're also here representing a second company, PCMI, which on the next slide you'll see is a company focused entirely on the payments and e-commerce sector. And this was spun out of our payments practice at AMI a couple of years ago because in contrast to AMI, which focuses exclusively on Latin American, Caribbean markets, PCMI is a global practice. In fact, this year we'll do close to 70% of our volume worldwide outside of Latin America. So we're very excited about the assignments we're taking on in places like Asia, North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, North America, as well as Latin America. And joining me from PCMI is Cesar Borelli, who is our Associate Managing Director for the Americas. Both of those gentlemen would be joining me in the latter part of our presentation today as we delve into those 5 trends. So let's begin, if we can move on to the next. Just to very briefly share with you today, we are essentially sharing with you our thoughts on the region, but this is not what pays the bills, as you might have gathered by the fact that it's a free webinar. What pays the bills are our paid assignments, and they're mostly those in-depth types of studies that we do, whether it's around sizing a market or understanding the competition or understanding the landscape of a market before our clients enter that market. But we also do presentations like this on a tailored basis in front of specific audiences, be it the internal C-suite audience of these kinds of clients, or if they themselves are running client-focused events and they want a third party, a thought leader, to join their roster of speakers. We do that as well. So happy to facilitate your needs. We mention this because this time of year is when so many of our clients are in planning mode, usually over a 2 to 3 day huddle with their country managers from the region, as well as their C-suite people, regional people. And oftentimes it behooves them to bring in a neutral voice that can provide some insight as to where things are growing over the next year, so that helps settle some of the disputes over monies, et cetera, that inevitably happens when each of these countries is pitching their ideas. And of course, there's never enough funding to fund all these ideas. So it's a good idea to have a third party objective voice at the table. That's the role that we serve in these meetings. Let's move forward. Again, I pointed out that I'm joined by Diego and Cesar, and of course, Abel, behind the scenes making it all happen, and of course, in charge of the promotion of this event. We have over close to 700 people registered for the event, so we're thrilled by the turnout that's generated. Let's move forward. Before we delve into the content, we are going to pepper you with a couple of different poll questions, and the first one has to do with, now that we're entering the fourth quarter of the year, we'd love to know what you guys expect out of the region's growth in your company this year versus last year. So we've given you several options there, from more than 25% growth to similar negative levels of the extreme. There's 7 different possibilities there. Please go ahead, assuming that you are in a position to understand your organization's growth levels this year versus last, and we'll take a look at that. We'll give you a couple more seconds to answer this question, and then Abel will publish the results. This is always very illuminating, I think, and often ends up contrasting how we looked at the region at the beginning of the year or this time last year. So we're getting there in terms of reaching, I think, the natural conclusion of responses. So Abel, anytime you want to go ahead and publish those results, feel free. So we've got a sort of a clustering of results around somewhere between 1 and 15% of growth, with some of you growing at even higher rates. So probably an average there of somewhere around 12 to 15%, which is pretty robust for a region that grew in real economic terms about 2%. It's not uncommon for this audience, typically multinationals, to outperform the region, and so. But this is a really good validation of quite a positive year. Okay, let's move forward and look at again. This presentation today is divided in 2 parts. The first will be an overview of the economics and politics of the region, and really the theme here is, and you've heard me say in the past that politics doesn't matter in Latin America, and that's because it's often been overshadowed by 2 more important forces. That is the price of commodities, whether they're rising or falling, or the price of international capital. But what we find ourselves today is an environment where the cost of capital is high by comparison over the last, say, 5 or 10 years, but by historic terms is pretty average and is starting to decline. So it's a fairly benign environment. And in terms of commodity prices, they are pretty close in real terms to their historic average. So those 2 factors are playing less of a role, and therefore what matters even more is politics. And by politics, I mean policy decisions that really impact investor perceptions of these markets and really help shape the movement of money in and out of these markets. And I chose these 3 characters to sort of symbolize that. Really, there's 2 countries that are going to have the most material impact and the most unpredictable material impact on Latin America next year. And that's Mexico on the one hand and Argentina on the other. In Mexico, we've just transitioned from AMLO to Sheinbaum. This was seen by many as a positive change. There's always a sense of renewal that comes with a new sexenio in Mexico, but obviously even more so with the fact that she was the first female president ever elected in Mexico. But AMLO, who presided over the slowest growth in Mexico in 36 years, his sexenio was the slowest in the last six sexenios, dropped a bit of a bomb on the world with his, I call it the September surprise, his series of constitutional reforms that he was allowed to do. He'd been biting the chomp to do it for 6 years, but was only afforded the ability to do it by the sweeping victory of Morena Party led by Claudia Sheinbaum. But she did not take over office until October 1st, versus the other 10,000 elected officials took over on September 1st. So that gave him a month to work with, and he did some big changes, not only the judicial reforms that people are familiar with, but also essentially decapitated 7 different regulatory agencies that have actually been essential at keeping things objective in key sectors, not to mention other constitutional reforms. So that has sent shockwaves through the investment community. Mexican investors were already wary of AMLO. I think international investors less so, but this really woke up in a bad way the awareness of international investors about Mexico. And it's going to have a material impact on GDP growth next year and on investment sentiment. The question is whether Sheinbaum can turn that around. On the other extreme, you've got Milei, who is the first libertarian president that we know of in Latin American history, and has really, shocked, excited, dismayed. He's a polemic figure. I think he's less polemic as a governor as he is as a campaigner. But his experiment at trying to unhinge the lock the Peronists have had in Argentina for decades is an experiment that we're still not sure is going to succeed. I think we're all hopeful that it will, but there's certainly a weakening of his support in the last couple of months as poverty levels have risen. And so that is also, these two countries are really going to be the great unknowns next year. Let's get into the numbers and the forecast. Again, politics matters. I've mentioned Mexico and Argentina. Colombia, the election of Petro really threw off investors. But as they began to realize that the institutionality of Colombia is pretty solid and that Petro has serious opposition both in Congress as well as the constitutional courts, investors realized that his ability to dramatically change Colombia, which he announced very early in his presidency, has not been realized thanks to that opposition. And so money has come back into Colombia. The currency dropped 22% in the year he was elected in 2022. That money has come largely back into Colombia. Investors are still not happy with him, but they're less frightened by him, and that's important. Another example, of course, is Chile, where Boric, although he was never of the sort of radical mindset of, say, a Petro, he nonetheless was uncharacteristically left-wing and of an academic, theoretical left, which was unusual in Chilean politics in recent memory. But again, both the voters through their own referendi, as well as just Congress, have really reined him in. And he, in his defense, has really shifted, pivoted to much more centrist policies. We also have the specter of we will have electoral change next year. And these all have boded well for Chile. So again, I won't go through every country, but needless to say that politics has been unusually influential in short-term economic movements in Latin America. It's always influential in long-term economic movements, but it's been particularly influential in the short-term movement of money and investor sentiment in the last couple of years. And that's not going to change next year. Let's move forward. When we look at net economic growth, and we look at the last 4 years, we see that Mexico and surprisingly Argentina were responsible for the big net increases. Now, this is a combination of real economic growth and, of course, currency movement. And where currencies weaken, like is the case of Brazil, that has a real negative impact on the economic changes. When we look forward over the next 4 years, we see, first of all, that net economic growth is going to be triple that of the last 4 years. So that's an important shift and a positive shift. We're also seeing that it's going to be Brazil and Argentina that dominate that, and Mexico is going to take a backseat on that new growth. Let's move forward. We also see, people often focus on foreign direct investment, but in fact, domestic investment is roughly 6 to 7 times the volume of foreign direct investment. And domestic investment tends to be more sensitive to political movement. Latin Americans themselves are far more in tune what's going on in their own countries than foreign investors tend to be, particularly institutional investors. And as you can see on the growth rates on the right, big differences in those growth rates. As you can see at the bottom there, Mexico is near the bottom, and curiously, Argentina as well. There's a real dichotomy. Foreigners are very bullish on Argentina, what Milei is doing. Argentines are not yet convinced, and that's reflected in the anticipated growth of domestic investment, private investment. Let's move forward. Okay, we'd like to ask you another poll question around your expected growth levels for your Latin American businesses this coming year, 2025. So if we could go ahead and post the poll and the options of answering there. All right, I won't delay things further. Maybe we'll come back to that. There seems to be a delay on this. Technical difficulty. All right, I'm going to go. Let's move forward in the respective time. And we're going to look at, drill down in some of these forecast numbers. So let's move to the next one. First of all, just to mention, the Latin America is growing at levels that are barely slightly below world growth levels. Now, that is essentially an improvement over the past, in the sense that LatAm used to fall behind world growth rates. Why? Because emerging markets like China really were at much more accelerated rates, and the US and the EU tended to be at rates closer to Latin America. Now we see that Latin America is going to be next year ahead of the US, ahead of the EU, still behind China and India, but nonetheless very close to world growth rates. And this is real growth, okay? Let's look at the next slide. This is the slide that you will not see in your Economist magazine. You will not see it in most presentations. This is nominal US dollar growth. And why does this matter? Because most of you who operate trans or pan Latin American businesses need to repatriate profits in dollars out of your businesses locally in these countries back into your home office, whether it's the United States, whether it's Holland, Germany, Japan, China, wherever it is. The reality is that when you talk to people who manage Latin American operations, they'll tell you the future of currencies in our major markets in Latin America has as much a material impact on how much profit I can repatriate as the actual volume growth. And if real growth is volume growth, nominal growth is how it's calculated in dollars. And the two bookend countries here are very telling of what could happen next year. On the one hand, Argentina could grow by 29% when measured in dollars. How on earth is that possible if its real growth is going to be closer to 4 or 5%? Well, the reason is the following. Argentina is at the cusp of floating its currency and even flirting with dollarization. Either of those moves, if done correctly, and we believe it will be done well, is going to unleash all kinds of institutional monies held by hedge funds and private equity and others that are prohibited from investing in a currency-controlled market, to unleash that money. And that money will, because the capital markets in Argentina are so small compared to its economy size, that will balloon asset prices. It will balloon the price of the currency. There will be an outflow of particularly Argentine savings as they move their peso wealth into dollars, but that will be still subject to controls. And so This is why we see a net increase in the currency. Um, when it comes to Mexico, there's still a fair bit of uncertainty, and therefore there's uncertainty around the currency. And so, even though Mexico may experience 1.5 to 2% real growth next year, in currency terms, it's probably going to continue to depreciate. And that's why we see, and this is really the underlying story of our presentation, the first part of our presentation, which is politics matters, and politics is changing the roster of those countries that drive your business in Latin America. Let's move forward. Similar, we're seeing foreign direct investment growing again, first of all, and that's a function of declining capital costs, particularly coming out of the Fed, but also this veer towards a more pragmatic center-right political policy making. Even if the characters are the same, their policies are changing or being reined in the case of Colombia, and that is giving greater confidence to foreign direct investors. And so we're seeing a resumption of growth in FDI, and that's incredibly important. You can see on the right the kinds of rates of growth there. Now, you may be surprised by a couple of numbers, such as Guyana shrinking. How is it possible the fastest growing economy in the world is shrinking in terms of foreign direct investment? It's because of such a bulk of direct investment by companies like Exxon already entered Guyana, and now they're repatriating profits, and some of those profits are being extracted. That's therefore the foreign direct investment flows are slowing down in Guyana, and it's now being converted into domestic investment. All right, let's move forward. If you are an exporter, if you're not actually investing in Latin America, but you're exporting products and services to Latin America, in spite of everything I've said in terms of growth rates and the rosters of countries that are driving growth, Mexico continues to be a very open economy for the moment. We'll see what happens with the US elections. And as a result, bats above its weight in terms of import growth. So we are still going to see Mexico and Brazil being the most important market for exporters, with Argentina, Guatemala, Peru, Chile sort of being those second-tier countries. Let's move forward. One last note on Latin America, we like to remind people this is the fastest aging region of the world. Let's look at the numbers just over the next 4 years in Brazil. There will be approximately 5 million more consumers above 50 years of age, and about 3 million fewer consumers under the age of 30. That means if you're in a mass consumer product category or service category, you have to begin shifting your offering, your messaging, your focus. And this is going on across most of the markets in Latin America, certainly the bigger markets like Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil. In some Central American markets, it's still a very young population and not aging as quickly. But in your bigger markets, this is a phenomenon that you have to be aware of if you're in the consumer-facing business. With that, we're about to transition to our next phase of the presentation. But I believe we have a poll question, and hopefully, technically, we're okay. I'm going to check in. Yes, great. So the question here is, which of the following market risks most concern you? And I believe we've set it up so you can pick 2 of these. Hopefully that's the case. If not, you'll be sort of stuck on one. But we're going to ask you about risk, because we know that risk drives some of your decision making, some of your consulting needs, some of your market intelligence needs. So it's certainly of interest to us to understand your thinking around risk. We've mentioned several here. First, US political change and what that might mean to the trade environment and how that impacts Latin America. Mexico, which I've already talked about, is potentially slowing down and further peso weakening. Failure to launch in Argentina, or even a backtracking on reforms as Milei's popularity weakens. Security issues in Mexico and elsewhere. Economic slowdown in Brazil. Continued political populism and what that means to policymaking. Escalation of conflict in the Mideast and or Ukraine and what that means to the thinking, particularly of your superiors in head office and how they may put the brakes on your plans. Competition from disruptive business models, which are still incredibly important and growing in several product categories. and the always present risk of cybersecurity. So those are the options. We appreciate your responses. I think, Abel, we're getting close to complete answers here. So go ahead and let's see how those turned out. So certainly the US and Mexico seem to be collectively the most important sources of risk. But populism, of course, is on everyone's mind and is still a danger in several markets for sure. We wanted to ask you that as well because we wanted to make an announcement on the next slide of a very interesting new presentation that we're going to be launching October 17th that involved Diego, myself, and a few Mexico-based analysts who work with us. And we're calling it a masterclass, the Mexico Investment Risk Masterclass. And the reason we're calling it a masterclass is two-part. Number one, it's going to be a 3-hour presentation. It will be divided in 3 different chapters, so you can tune in for which ones you want. And we're also going to charge a modest fee of, I believe it's $95, because we're really going to be pouring a lot of thought and investment of our own into this presentation. So we hope you will join us, or at least register for this, because by registering, you will receive the recording as well as the deck afterwards. So with that, we're ready to move to part 2 of our webinar today. And that's talking about 5 leading trends. And the way we approach these trends on the next slide is that we're approaching it from 3 different segments of the economy. The consumer economy, which will be led by Cesar Borrelli, whose perspective is really formed by the payments and e-commerce industry, but his comments will resonate across anyone operating in the consumer economy. The B2B economy, led by Diego Rodriguez, who runs our logistics and industrial practices. And again, I think will resonate across that sector. And the extractive or primary economy, which I will comment on, which really comes from our energy and mining practices. So we're going to look at these 5 trends, and I'm going to turn it over to Diego to talk about our first trend.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your comments. I think you set the stage really well to talk about these 5 trends. And the first one, everyone is talking about artificial intelligence. And I have participated in multiple events recently. And my key takeaway is that artificial intelligence will benefit Latin America the most when you think about the emerging markets. And the key reason for that is that artificial intelligence will raise workers' productivity. So when you think about the developed world, automation is the key goal when it comes to artificial intelligence. But in Latin America, workers' productivity is the greatest obstacle that the region has faced in the last 30 years. And the reason is basically that in the 60s, Latin America the GDP per capita was 3 times higher than Southeast Asia. And in 2024, Southeast Asia GDP per capita is 40% greater than Latin America. And the main reason for that is workers' productivity. So we have a great news for you that are participating today, and is the fact that Latin American companies are investing, and they have dozens and hundreds of internal projects adopting artificial intelligence, as you can see on the left side. However, on the right side, you see the percentage of adults who are comfortable sharing data with a given institution, especially with artificial intelligence tools, is really low. And the main reason for that is the high levels of mistrust. So before I talk about the impacts of artificial intelligence in logistics, I would like to bring my colleagues, Cesar and John, to talk about how artificial intelligence is impacting, for instance, the consumer sector, Cesar, and then John with the energy and mining sectors, and then I come back to the logistics space.
Absolutely. Thank you, Diego. Yeah, this is such a hot topic within the consumer space. So I think we should highlight here that in terms of financial services in general, this has a very strong potential, and already we already can see some of the data and the savings that the companies are publishing. So we have an interesting data from JP Morgan saying that they were able to uplift their account opening approvals in between 15 and 20% with the usage of AI. So there is a very strong use case for the technology in the region, and I think mainly applied to the financial services sector. Whenever we can see large sets of data and a lot of the automation and improvements, and like I said, the kind of like the lack of productivity that we are used to seeing in the region, I think the artificial intelligence has a tremendous potential. I'll just divide here kind of like the first wave of AI, which has been a very good fit for the financial services industry. It has been very focused on like internal processes, like improving credit applications, improving account opening processing, improving fraud detection. I think we are already seeing a lot of those real life use cases. But I think the second wave, which is my prediction for next year, it's probably something more focused on the consumer, right? Like what's the
Let me
John, if you want to
jump.
jump in.
Sure,
Yeah.
let me jump in, Cesar. I know I've got some
thing
connectivity issues.
for
Oh, there we go.
sorry.
We lost you for a sec, Cesar. Go ahead, please finish your thoughts.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I was just going to finish saying that I think the second wave will be heavily focused on personalization, right? I think services that will be more focused on the end user and the final consumers, instead of just improving the internal processes for institutions. And I think you mentioned about the privacy concerns. I think that's a concern from a consumer perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. There's a lot happening around. Each market has their local equivalent of GDPR, and AI is also a hot topic when you talk about data privacy. But
What about
just
you,
moving
John?
on.
Thank you, Cesar. What about you, John?
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to share. I was in a meeting, very interesting leadership meeting yesterday, and some really fascinating insights came out. But what was clear to me is that the large companies operating in Latin America and around the world, frankly, are really embracing AI, and they're applying it to all kinds of all areas of their business. And this is really the iceberg under the water that we don't see, that will materialize in the form of actual product changes and consumer facing new approaches in the next year or two. But there's so much work going on right now. It's really remarkable. On the energy side, there's certainly a lot of efficiency gains that can be made in terms of generating electricity at the right time of day, the way it's stored and the way it's transmitted. But honestly, Latin America, with few exceptions, needs to modernize its transmission infrastructure. That's where even more efficiency gains are going to be made than trying to tweak old infrastructure with AI. But I think, generally speaking, if AI is adopted at the levels that this graph on the left shows, we are going to see the construction of a lot of data centers across Latin America to try to support that AI usage. And those data centers are big, big consumers of energy. And so we're going to see a material impact on electricity demand. And for a lot of countries, that new demand for electricity will come from renewables, particularly in countries like Brazil and Chile, who lead in this area, but also areas like Puerto Rico, Colombia, and others that have taken the right steps to embrace the energy transition. So it's an exciting impulse for that transition. And the electricity sector is excited about AI for that reason.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And just to complement what you just said, there's a great example, for instance, when it comes to data centers, power generation, and AI. Just last week, Google canceled or delayed a plan to launch a data center in Santiago because of shortages of electricity and concerns about the impact that this data center could have in the country. So that's a concrete and material example in terms of how the region needs to adapt and how it needs to invest in some sectors to become part of this artificial intelligence revolution. Now, when it comes to logistics, I just want to focus on a key message. So companies are using artificial intelligence in the logistics and transportation space in Latin America to raise productivity. raise productivity when it comes to route optimization, vehicle rotation, because when we think about traffic jams in Latin America, in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo, that's a great cost for last mile companies. And on the other side of the equation is data forecasting. Data forecasting is critical for logistics and manufacturing companies in terms of how they can predict changes in demand. And now that we're going through the strike in the East and Gulf Coast in the US, that usage for artificial intelligence, how they can adjust inventory and demand is critical, especially when we think about in the next 4 to 8 weeks. So I'll stop here and I'll pass the floor to my colleague Cesar, who will present the second trend, which is.
All right, thank you, Diego. So I think the second trend here, economic nationalism, I think it's not a new topic for the region. I think we have been seeing that for quite some time throughout the years. It's actually not even a new topic. I think across the globe, we are seeing a lot of different cases around economic nationalism. What I want to bring here is some of the recent recent cases we saw in the region and why we think this is a broader trend, right? I think the first one that I want to highlight here within the consumer space, it was the discussion between Musk and Alexandre de Moraes in Brazil around the Twitter or X. So Alexandre de Moraes is a judge for the Supreme Federal Court in Brazil, and among several controversial cases around confidentiality of data and around censorship, he ordered Elon Musk to have a local representative in the country. So the order was actually because Musk decided to close the X office in Brazil, not leaving anyone in the country responsible for the platform. So that resulted in Alexandre prohibiting any Brazilian to access Twitter or X, and even the order even said that even a person, a Brazilian citizen, accessing X even through a VPN was subjected to fines. So that's the final decision. It's still a lot happening, but I think it's an emblematic case of economic nationalism. Just before I pass that to Diego, I just wanted to highlight some other cases within the payment space. So we have seen across the region many real-time payment schemes being born, with Brazilian Pix being one of the most famous ones. And it's usually a central bank or a government-led initiative that for a lot of people has a big potential of shifting the revenues from multinational payment processor companies and bring the processing and the revenues for those transactions closer to the home country. So just I'm gonna leave with two cases, and I know Diego and John have more to say about it.
Thank you, Cesar. So when it comes to economic nationalism, this is the golden opportunity for Latin America to insert in the global supply chains as the geopolitical rivalry between the US and China intensifies. However, the reality is that Latin America is fumbling the ball right now, especially Mexico, when we think about economic nationalism and how the country is able to attract foreign investors. So let me be absolutely clear with this point. We have multiple examples in which Latin American countries have tremendous opportunities. In Central America, for instance, in the textile and apparel sectors, to insert their manufacturing capacities into the US market. However, the lack of port infrastructure or the lack of industrial spaces or even paved roads become a substantial obstacle for companies. So I have here in the slide a key example of Costco China versus Peru as economic nationalism. And I'm sure that those in the logistics industry are familiarized with this specific case, but the ones that are not might be surprised to hear the context of the story. So very quickly, the reality is that Costco invested over $3 billion in a port in Peru named Chancay. And 2 weeks ago, they were testing the unloading and loading of a big ship. So the port will be operational by the end of the year before the APEC summit. And the reality is that port will transform the ocean lanes across Latin America and China. And the reason for economic nationalism is that China, in its economic ambitions, it's also making a transition. So the days in which China made loans to indebted countries just as part of their strategy to offload their US dollar reserves, those days probably are gone. And now they're focusing on the energy transition and how they can extract minerals and commodities and foods and perishables out of South America. So this port will likely connect the West Coast with Brazil, for instance. And Lula has been talking about reviving a project that has been in the works for the past 30 years and that never materialized. And now China is the top trading partner of Brazil. So the case to connect Brazil with this port on the West Coast of South America becomes even more important. And the Peruvians, at the beginning of the year, they wanted to shift the conditions of this agreement. And they couldn't because the Chinese government pressured the Peruvians to adjust their laws, internal laws, allowing exclusivity to Costco to operate this terminal. So the reality is that Peru, they had to change the laws because they couldn't risk to lose investments from China in the mining sector or in the automotive sector or in the consumer sector. So the reality is that economic nationalism is playing in both ways, in the US and in China. And my expectation is that China will continue investing in Latin America, especially in the ports and infrastructure sector, to compete with the US in the race to this economic transition towards the decarbonization of the globe. So I like to pass the floor to my colleague John to see what's going on in the mining and energy sectors.
Thanks, Diego. That's a great point. There are few countries in Latin America that are in an economically strong position that have a rule of law that enables them to stand up to the kind of lobbying power of a unified front from, say, China. One of those is Chile, another one is Brazil. But for most countries in Latin America, it's the combination of carrot and stick that comes out of China is very difficult to stand up to. Look, in mining in particular, energy less so, economic nationalism has been a factor for a long time. The reason we pointed out the first quantum investment copper mine in Panama and why that was surprising was in the past, economic nationalism has been used as a political tool to either win an election by essentially painting the governing power as a sort of pro-colonialist government that is acquiescing to international investors in mining, of course, having enormous historical baggage in Latin America, or was used as sort of an extortionary tool to extract more money out of a company. A great example would be Barrick in the Dominican Republic when a change of government, when Fernandez was out and Danilo was in, and he essentially used that moment to extract another $1 billion out of Barrick through some very tense negotiations. What happened in Panama was truly different. And I say that because the government was keen on the project. The project was going to contribute enormous amounts of tax revenue to Panama, as well as generate lots of dollar export income, both very essential to a country that's dollarized. But also, they understood the strategic importance of copper. Copper is one of those metals that's not talked about enough, but it's just as important as lithium in terms of the energy transition. And what happened in Panama that nobody saw coming, because Panama has not been a mining jurisdiction in the past. There's not been popular public level dissatisfaction with the mining industry, and it kind of sprung out of nowhere. And a lot of these protests were organized through pretty elaborate TikTok-driven campaigns. So there's all kinds of speculation as to the true origins of these protests. But the point is that the government was caught off guard. And when your own people are telling you that you're acquiescing to a foreign power and using a combination of economic nationalism and environmentalism then the government had no choice but to shut things down. Now, they may end up backpedaling on that, but it is an example of how voter sentiment around economic nationalism is also as important as what the political class thinks about it. So just that's an interesting new element. Let's move forward to the next trend, which is almost a kind of a counterweight to that economic nationalism. That's fiscal constraint. Because when you're in a tight fiscal situation, you cannot exercise such luxuries as economic nationalism. And as you see here, over the last several years prior to COVID, debt levels had been growing in Latin America. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because public debt, frankly, in Latin America is at levels that are far less than Europe, United States, Canada, China, etc. But what happened with COVID was, in so many countries in Latin America, fiscal discipline went out the window. It was a very tough period of time. These countries rely on value-added taxes in their service economy to drive tax revenue, and the service economies came to a halt for almost 10 to 12 months. That was, there was a lot of corruption during COVID in terms of bad spending decisions. So since COVID, Latin America has been in a situation of fiscal restraint, particularly as inflation went up, and that forced central banks to raise interest rates, which made the cost of managing that debt even costlier, which really, really curtailed what governments could spend on. And this has had a material effect certainly in the resource industry and energy. It's meant that governments haven't, and remember, governments own a lot of the big energy companies in Latin America. It's meant almost zero new investment in those state-owned energy companies. But I'd like to ask you first, Diego, what has it meant for the B2B economy, for logistics and industrial?
Thank you, John. The key takeaway here is that Latin American governments do not have the fiscal bandwidth to invest on port infrastructure. And as I was just discussing a few moments ago, port infrastructure is critical and logistics infrastructure is critical to insert our region into the global supply chains. So that is a massive obstacle that Latin America is facing. However, it's also a great opportunity for private port operators, because now they have a great opportunity to find in the very business-friendly jurisdictions great opportunities in terms of ports that are underdeveloped, and they have massive space to build logistics parks and logistics centers, so companies can set up shop, produce there, and quickly export. So that's the opportunity when we think about these fiscal constraints. So Mexico, for instance, DP World just recently announced that they're looking for a port in Mexico to find land and deep harbor space to develop their operations to supply the North American supply chains through those facilities. Recently, CGM acquired more than 50% of Port Santos operation, and in the next 12 to 24 months, they will acquire the 100% equity on that terminal and across different terminals in Brazil. So the trend that we will see in the next 12 to 24 months is private port operators looking for opportunities. And also when you think about the e-commerce space, and I think Cesar will talk about this, the cross-border space. So I'll briefly talk about this, and then Cesar can talk in greater detail. So when we think about cross-border e-commerce, countries have been trying to look avenues to set up new import tariffs. For instance, in Brazil, in June, I think in June and July, they set a 20% tariff on shipments value under $50. those were excluded under the minimis rules, and now they're taxed. And the reality is that they may say that it's because of fairness with the retail sector, but the reality is that they're looking for new tax revenue. And that's not only in Brazil, in Colombia, it's also happening. So cross-border e-commerce and the digital economies are under potential risk to be attacked by governments trying to get more revenue. So when you think about how will that impact logistics, I have a key takeaway to pass the floor to Cesar. The reality is that we may see Chinese companies like Shein or Temu actually producing in the textile and apparel sector in Brazil or in Colombia, trying to avoid those restrictions, or in Mexico, for instance. And the other case is the US. The US, just 2 weeks ago, the White House announced a proposed rulemaking to include the majority of imports from China under the 201 and 301 restrictions, which means that 70% of those shipments coming from China in the textile and apparel sectors would be excluded of the de minimis threshold. So that creates a lot of opportunities for Latin America to actually, for those local textile players in Colombia or in Central America, to actually sell directly to consumers. And that will create a lift to the air freight industry. So those opportunities are start to rise, and the players that identify them quickly and act rapidly will come on top. So Cesar, I'd like you to connect my point with how your consumer sector is being disrupted by the fiscal constraints and the new taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think raising taxes, I think, has never been so unpopular with the advent of internet. I think most countries are, and most people in those countries are very unfavored to raising taxes. But like Joe said, in order to balance the accounts, some governments they do need to increase taxes. And one of the things that we see on the consumer space, I think you mentioned correctly, like some of the cases, right? I think coming off the pandemic, I think the region has financial inclusion has been growing a lot in the region. A lot of the transactions have been digitized through real-time payment systems, through like new accounts, new bank account, through fintechs, and the government also see an opportunity to understand better those flows and to tax those flows, right? So I'm just gonna leave you guys with a few examples here. I think the first one you mentioned about the cross-border space. The Brazil government is actually taxing the products coming mainly from China, but overall internationally. There is a big discussion around digital goods as well, and I think this is happening in several markets. With the streaming platforms and all the digital content being distributed online, how the countries can collect taxes on those payments. And I think the last one I have still on Brazil, it's around the betting space, like online betting, right? There is an interest. There is a new regulation in Brazil that requires companies to have a local entity in Brazil, to pay a local license, to have minimal capital requirements, and those flows will also be taxed. So yeah, there's an increasing concern about taxes, especially around those digital flows.
It's very interesting. There's a real pattern there of governments either deciding to tax more or to cut costs and defer to the private sector. And clearly in the digital space, which is traditionally being undertaxed versus the conventional business areas, there's an inclination to tax more. Whereas in some of the traditional industries, there's a realization that the government isn't going to be able to invest, and therefore they're going to rely on PPP programs and others for private investment. So that's a really interesting, one really has to study country by country and industry by industry to understand this trend. Let's move to the next one.
All right, so let me take this one. So local heroes, and what we call local heroes here are the Latin America headquarter companies that were able to go through the pandemic. Some of them came out stronger on the other side. Some of them end up failing. But I think that the message here is, I think from 2023 up to now, I think we have 32 unicorns in the region, two more than we have 32 today. We end up last year with 30. And what we see is that we see a very short group of stars like Nubank, Mercado Libre, and iFood, for example, that are very large companies, very well capitalized in a very strong cash position, and companies that are still expanding in their home markets, still expanding to other markets in Latin America, and they are seen as very strong benchmarks for the region. But then when we go down a little bit and we try to find some of the other startups and unicorns, we see a very, very small number of companies that are actually profitable. And some of those companies had suffered a lot during the funding crunch from the VCs. And what we are seeing right now, just to put in perspective, I think in the region we have a little over 3,000 fintechs at this point. And we probably have a little over 1% of those fintechs being profitable. So it's a very small number. We have seen some companies being able to survive and reach break even or become profitable. But we do see a huge number of companies that will probably either fail or be acquired within the next year or two. So we do expect some consolidation in the region across different consumer segments. But Diego, curious to understand your perspective on the B2B space.
Thank you, Cesar. In the case of the logistics industry, I expect to see a massive consolidation wave in the next 24 months because the story is completely different to what you have in the fintech space. You have a fewer number of startups, and the majority of them are not cash flow positive today. So what are they doing every week? I'm sure you guys have seen news about partnerships or mergers or acquisitions in the logistics space. So the reality is that in the next 3 years, legacy logistics players will find a tremendous opportunity to acquire disruptive technologies and minds. And if we think about how challenging it is for a legacy player, which is immersed in bureaucracy, internal politics, all of that becomes an obstacle for innovation and disruption. So this opportunity in the next 3 years is massive for players to acquire these companies. And also, when we think about last mile logistics, I expect to see a clash of the titans. I expect to see more traditional marketplaces moving into the delivery of groceries and foods in a way to expand. And we have seen how Rappi, iFood, and others are actually becoming super apps, and that's part of what they do. So they're looking to expand in the logistics space. And for sure, I expect to see some of these key players in the industry actually spawning off some of the companies and the services that they have created for logistics and last mile and transportation and fulfillment, actually serving the overall market, not only their clientele in the marketplace, but they're moving out, like in the US with Walmart, with Go Local. That's a key example, with Amazon offering its ocean services to its marketplace players. So I expect to see something similar in Latin America. And on the other side, the disruptive companies, these startups, these unicorns, they are looking to capitalize their massive networks and their massive gig economy. So they want to extract more revenue out of their networks, and they are looking to also deliver low value ticket e-commerce items. So that's the clash of the titans that I expect to see in the next few months. And I'm just curious to know, John, what is happening with the local heroes and this trend in the energy and mining space?
Well, thanks, Diego. The definition of local hero might be slightly different for, let's say, the mining sector, because the financing and the startup dynamic is very different. But most of the small mining activity, particularly exploration in recent memory in the last 10, 15 years, has been driven by foreign, often Canadian junior mining companies. But they've hit a financing crunch over the last few years. And as a result, this has provided a window of opportunity for the more established, historic Latin American-owned mining companies, particularly in traditional mining jurisdictions like Peru, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, to move in, gobble up the exploration concessions that have come to light over the last several years, and improve their positions in these markets. So they've really taken advantage of that. And I think on the energy side, again, it's driven mostly by foreign capital, but there are definitely some local players of note in places like Brazil and Chile, which really lead the renewable energy sector in Latin America, those two markets. And in particular in Chile, where much of the financing and interest has been driven, there are some very interesting local players there. But again, I don't believe it's a very different dynamic, and the definition of a local here is quite different.
Definitely, definitely. So moving on to the last trend, the Zoomers and the Boomers. So in the past 50 years, Latin Americans have gained another life. They have gained 30 years of life expectancy, and what they will do with those additional 30 years will change dramatically the way that companies service those consumer segments and the way that the economy evolves in Latin America. And as John described in one of the previous slides, Brazil is probably one of the fastest aging countries along with Mexico. So I remember everyone talking about the demographic dividend, and we're still benefiting of that. But the next decade seems to be, again, the golden opportunity for many companies to create wealth out of these new consumer segments that we're seeing in Latin America. So in my case, for instance, I was raised by my grandmother. I don't think that my children will have that opportunity, because the elderly will be thinking about traveling. Well, they will be thinking about themselves. They will become empty nesters, and that creates a new whole dynamic. And when you go back to the other segment, the Zoomers, this new generation, Gen Zs, sometimes they are not even working in an office, but they are working from home, and they are not loyal to any brand. So how that is gonna impact your sector, it's gonna be really interesting. So let me just talk about briefly about logistics, and then I'll pass the floor to my colleagues. So when it comes to logistics, the reality is that many of the companies in the region are run by the elderly generation, by those CEOs, CFOs. And recently I read a study published by Goldman Sachs in which shippers and cargo owners are willing to pay only 5% more for a premium in terms of using greener deliveries. And the reality is that if we want to achieve the net zero goals, especially in the logistics space, in some industries, the premium needs to be as high as 50%. So what companies and what sectors are willing to pay that premium? There are certainly pockets of opportunity, for instance, pharmaceutical firms, food and beverage firms that are heavily exposed to the Zoomers. Those are some opportunities. But when you think about, again, as John mentioned, how Latin America can insert in the transition of the green fuels, especially green hydrogen in Chile or in Panama, creating massive opportunities to develop new industries in the transition towards a more friendly economy and a more sustainable economy, is the path that companies start to think about, because opportunities are massive in Latin America in the next 5 years, but depending on how we move forward, will set the stage for to grab those opportunities. So in the consumer space, Cesar, what's going on with this trend?
Thank you, Diego. I think you had mentioned a few useful insights and cases. I think in general, it's a way less loyal generation when we talk about the Gen Z. Very digitized. So people that were born already with digital solutions. So the cell phones take the place of wallets, and we see that clearly with the high adoption with digital wallets and digital payment methods. We do see here, I think, kind of like a two-angle observation, right? I think the first observation is, like you said, I think it is a generation that it hasn't been super focused on buying things, buying a car or buying like a property, right? They do value the experience. And I think that's part of the generation, and we see that as a consumer habit. But we also see, as a result of the job market and the economic situation, a lot of those young people, growing without the same stability as other generations had, right? So that leads to inflation. Because of the inflation, that leads to less income. That led to the increase of products such as buy now, pay later in several markets. So we do see that as a trend. That also, it's an outcome of the current economic situation. Then on the flip side, I think we do see a stronger acquisition since people are living more. You see a strong purchase habits around traveling, healthcare, services in general. And we also see that population growing in terms of becoming more digital, right? Having access to e-commerce. I think this probably varies among the different income levels, but the wealthier, it's more willing to experiment and use on a daily basis digital channels, social media, and we do see a growing for that as well. But John, I think you also have some interesting perspective on the extractive economy.
Thanks, Cesar. I'm going to combine my response about particularly energy with an answer to John Welsh's question about how, what's our thoughts on how demographics have shaped the economic growth of the region. And John is a leading Latin American economist, lived many years in Brazil. And John, as you know, in very, very blunt terms, economic growth is driven by how many people are working and how productive they are. And in many parts of the world, particularly Asia, economic growth is being driven by productivity gains in the last 15 years, as well as some population growth, but really productivity gains. Latin America, almost 80% of its growth is being driven by demographics. And by that, I mean, you have this demographic shift whereby the average woman in Latin America has gone from having 5 children 35, 40 years ago to 2 children today. And what that has done is it has freed up the time of women to, instead of being 100% dedicated to looking after those 5 kids, they now have more time to go out and earn an income outside of the house. And that has been a material shift. That increase in the labor pool has been a material shift. It also means that from a consumer standpoint, instead of spending all your money on housing, clothing, food, the basics to keep your family going, you have more disposable income for some of these more sort of luxurious spending items like travel, like consumer electronics, schooling, training, all of these things. And you're seeing the sort of above average growth levels out of Latin America in those disposable spending items. So that's been the big shift. In terms of what it means for energy, well, one of the big shifts has been that people move out of their house a lot sooner. So when I lived in Mexico many years ago, with few exceptions, you lived at home until you were married. And that's fine if you're getting married at 23, but if you're getting married at 33, that's a long time to live under the roof with your parents. And so a lot of people started to move out, and that shrunk the average household. It meant that there was demand for more households, for more furniture, for more of those kinds of goods, basic goods in your house. And that meant a much greater consumption of energy. And that continues, that trend continues. And as a result, we're seeing energy demand growth in Latin America at still quite high levels. I think we've got other questions, and I'm going to hand it over to Abel to sort of moderate us and guide us through those questions and direct traffic.
All righty, sounds good. Let's take a look here at what we have here. Since we were still on the whole idea of generational, I wanted to start off with a question from Stephanie, which is, what about the millennials? Do you see important changes in their behavior and also in the way they perceive the future?
Cesar, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, absolutely, John. Yeah, well, I think this is a very interesting angle, right? Because when you see people getting living longer, and also the millennials having kids, it becomes a very interesting dynamic where sometimes the millennials will have to take care of their parents and also their kids at the same time. So I think from an income perspective, it is a very they have been very impacted by this, and I think the trend is that with people living longer and kids also staying at home longer, I think it's going to be a huge burden on the millennials from an income perspective.
You brought a really good point that I can connect with the logistics space and the fact that millennials have less time. They're eating more ready-to-eat meals, and that is driving the consumption of and the demand for cold storage spaces across Latin America. That is driving demand for temperature control, transportation, and creates opportunities in a region that just a decade ago was really underfunded when it comes to infrastructure to sell the cold storage space, and now is booming in some countries like Chile and Brazil. So that's the way that we can connect the generational trends with our industries.
All righty, sounds good. Now, this brings us to a different direction, which could be focused a little bit more on politics. We have a couple of questions, one from Daniel and one from Vanessa, but they're both very similar. It's about the impact of the upcoming U.S. presidential elections. Daniel's more into the pros and cons of each U.S. candidate from a LatAm perspective, and then Vanessa's asking about the risks posed to the investment climate by the U.S. election results. So I think those both can sort of be handled in the same response. So I wanted to pose that to John for him to field.
Sure. Thanks, Abel. Yes, I think we sort of avoided really tackling U.S. electoral risk in this webinar because it's still so speculative. I don't think the U.S. is much different than anywhere else in the world in the sense that what is said on the campaign trail does not necessarily transition into policy making. There's lots of hurdles that any policy promises actually need to overcome. But we know a few things. We know that Trump has promised, at the very least, to target Chinese products, regardless of where they are assembled, with additional tariffs going into the United States. The legality of doing so, and therefore upending the USMCA if it's Chinese products assembled in Mexico, remains questionable. There are, I know anecdotally, lots of cases in Mexico where the Chinese have essentially paid their way into certificates of origin being misrepresented. And in fact, their products assembled in Mexico are not compliant with USMCA local content rules, even if they are certified as such. And that may be one of the points of scrutiny that, regardless of who wins in the US, could be definitely targeted. Trump has promised a 10% tariff on all imports. Again, that would end up violating probably over a dozen trade agreements that the US has in vigor with different partners around the world. Not to mention the fact that given that the US lacks manufacturing capacity today and relies on outsourcing, would be essentially a direct tax on consumers. So I'm not sure that he would get the legislative support for that. Coming out of Harris presidency, she is still smarting over the fact that she was unable to pass immigration reform bill that was put together with a lot of bipartisan support initially, but was essentially, because of strong lobbying by Trump within the branch of the Republican Party that he can influence, it was turned down. And I think that this immigration reform is sort of a way of redeeming herself is going to be a priority for her. It's much needed in the United States. Immigration laws in the United States are outdated. And nobody doubts the fact that border security is an issue with Mexico. So this will have an impact potentially on the flow of people going north, and therefore eventually on the impact of remittances and things like that. We've seen that as migration slowed in the past, remittances would eventually, what happens is when a migrant goes into in the States from abroad, the first couple of years is sending a lot of money back, but eventually they settle down their own roots there. They meet a partner, they get married, they have kids, and those remittances all but dry up. So that is a pattern. But when there's a surge of immigration, as we've had in the last couple of years, yes, remittances turn up again. But again, it lasts only for about 4 or 5 years. So those are a couple of examples. You really have to look at a country by country basis. It does change across the region. Trinidad is a country where is very much threatened by the idea that the U.S. could produce and export a lot more natural gas under a Republican administration versus a Democrat administration who wants to cap that natural gas within the United States. So it's really comes down to policies and industries and which countries are impacted by that.
All right. To shift gears a little bit to a different direction, Oscar is posing a question about nearshoring, and he asks if the panel foresees an important Chinese nearshoring investment in Mexico in the near future.
I like to tackle that. So recently we did an analysis, and the numbers reflect that Chinese are investing heavily in Mexico. They are setting up manufacturing facilities, they're buying industrial spaces. So when you look at the actual data, it is happening. And I think depending on the results of the US election, this year has been a real tricky when you think about data because of the uncertainty related to Mexican and US elections. So many firms have delayed their investments in Mexico just to wait up to see what happens in the US election, who wins. That will determine, for instance, if the Tesla plant in Mexico moves forward or not. So that is one key example of how things are just in a wait and see pattern. And I'm sure that in 2025, depending on the results of the election, we will see a boost in FDI, especially in Mexico, compared to this year's number. Now, one key element that we haven't discussed, and I like to talk about nearshoring, and a question that I see here is about the US striking the East and Gulf Coast ports. So the election results might hinge on how long the situation remains in the economy. I'm pretty sure that the 99% of individuals working on the logistics and supply chain industries, they knew about this probably since last year or even the beginning of the year in January. So companies, they have made their plans, they move forward their imports. So I'm sure we won't have shortages of goods in the next week because companies plan accordingly. And this was a real scenario. Now, I have heard analysts talking about challenges when it comes to perishable imports into South Florida. The reality is that bananas are massively produced by Chiquita, and they do not rely in ILA workers. So they are not affected by this. So let's be clear that the companies have prepared for this scenario, and what is likely to happen is an increase in rates, in shipping rates, in ocean rates, because some companies like CMA, CGM, they have declared force de majeure, and basically they and others will start charging additional costs to shipping into the US East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. So how long this situation remains in the economy might I take the results of the election for sure, because I think 2 weeks ago I was very bullish in terms of seeing Harris winning the presidency, but now it becomes a toss-up. So that will impact nearshoring for sure. Nearshoring volumes, I expect to see a Harris administration more involved in Central America and in the Caribbean, because she knows, she has experience, she has traveled to those regions when she was vice president, and she knows what plans needs to be pushed, what investments need to be moved forward, so nearshoring activities and investments can actually materialize. However, on the other side, Trump is more transactional. I don't think the 20% tariffs or the 10% tariffs will actually be implemented. It's just part of the rhetoric. I don't think they will materialize based on the WTO rules. However, I'm very concerned with the fact that Trump and the US, not only Trump, but the US politic and Congress is thinking about removing the most favored nation status to China. And that could upend the world economy in terms of trade flows. So that is probably the most critical element and the most material impact that we will see in 2025, probably in the next, in January or February, because that is soon to happen.
All right, thank you, Diego. So to shift gears a second, because John touched on remittances, and turns out that we have a couple of questions that are focused on that topic. I thought it might be interesting to try to focus on those briefly. So Harry is asking about what the expectation of the remittance flows into Mexico over the next few years, because it dropped during the elections, and at the same time, Gabrielle's pointing out that the remittances have been growing due to immigration, and will that trend keep going? So we just sort of have a bit of a dichotomy there. Might be good to address both if possible.
Well, look, remittance flows are driven by obviously, how many people are in the market, particularly people who've arrived within 5 years. As I mentioned, there's a dynamic there to keep an eye on. And then, of course, how robust are the incomes of those immigrants, which is a function of the U.S. economy. And then, for example, during COVID, there were certain states that came out of quarantine faster than others. Texas, Florida came out of quarantine much sooner than California and New York. And so remittance flows out of Texas and Florida resumed much faster than those. So the local economic prospects in the United States is a factor. And of course, how dire the situation is in the markets from where they came is another function. So if you've got a crisis, if you have a currency slump, then that will also trigger greater demand of remittances. There's a lot of factors there to keep in mind. I wanted to address some of the questions related more generally to the economic and political transition in Mexico. Somebody asked, why are we projecting negative growth in Mexico? And I want to point out that there's a big difference between real economic growth, which is forecast to decline next year, but still be positive about 1.5% in Mexico, versus nominal growth, which is, and when measured in dollars, which combines real growth with currency movement. And the reason that we believe that the peso will continue to soften over the next year is a combination of two factors. Number one is, whenever you have the first year of a sexenio, and those of you who've been following the Mexican market will know this, there is a hesitation on behalf of all investors to wait and see what will happen with the policy priorities of the new president, where the opportunities are, where the risks are, where there'll be regulations that aid industry, where there'll be regulations that hurt industry. This is doubly the case when we have a president who is very much a disciple of an outgoing president who created his own political party and remains an omnipotent power within that party. And so the ability of AMLO to continue to influence, and his own personal desire to maintain the legacy of his policies, remains to be seen whether that will be accepted and followed by Sheinbaum, or if she will begin to project her own vision, in part as a response to the worries of the investment community. And so that 1 year of typically slow investment might end up being actually 2 years of slow investment. The other factor is that Mexico is an emerging market, and in financial market terms, big institutional funds that are responsible for huge portions of the daily movement of money in and out of a market have begun to underweight Mexico versus where they were. They are shifting some of their underweight in Brazil to greater weight in Brazil, and some of their overweight in Mexico to underweight. And that's partly a function also of the sovereign debt ratings. Yesterday, Brazil's rating was given an uptick. It is still below investment grade, but only one notch below investment grade. Mexico's sovereign debt rating is still investment grade, but is one notch away from becoming junk. Those movements have huge impacts on the flow of monies into these two countries. And the trend right now is that Brazil is going to capture more of those emerging market funds, and Mexico will capture less. And that is going alone will move the currency. So that's bigger than any currency movement that comes out of nearshoring. It's bigger than any movement that comes out of government spending. It is a huge factor. And so that's what's behind the expected decline in the Mexican peso over the next 12 to 24 months.
Abel,
Related to, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, I'd like to address one question or complement my answer to the US strike and the impact in the logistics sector, because I talk about the US elections, but not so much about the impact in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the reality is that we might start to see backlogs and delays and a shortage of capacity when it comes to the exports, for instance, of Brazil, the east coast of South America. We don't have ships available to export products and commodities out of the Caribbean and South America, because of these ships are anchored in the East Coast or in the Gulf ports in the US. So we might start to see a shortage of capacity when it comes to the export side. And as the situation procrastinates, the reality is that both parties, they don't have any powerful incentive to sit down and negotiate. So the reality will hinge in terms of how much the White House can wait to implement the necessity for negotiations between the two sections of this strike. So for Latin America, it is crucial to wait and see what happens in the next 2 weeks, but shortage of capacity is for sure the main problem that we will see in the region.
All righty. Well, thank you, Diego. So you may have noticed that we switched one of the slides there, and this is sort of to remind you about the Mexico risk investment risk masterclass, and that's because we've had some questions, obviously, about that and Mexico itself and the direction it's going to be taken with Scheinbaum. So this is a way, if you have your phone there, you can quickly scan and explore that a little bit further and decide whether that would be interesting for you to attend. We're going to be having that in a couple of weeks and going into a great detail with operational risks in Mexico and other types of risks to keep an eye out for as the administration changes and things move forward with nearshoring. So while we're on the topic of Mexico right now, I did want to circle back to it real quick so we can just sort of take the Mexico questions off the slate, so to speak. We had one that was still pending, which came from Juan, which was about Claudia Sheinbaum. And she had promised a great emphasis on digitalization. And what Juan would like to know is if this includes AI utilization.
I'm not familiar with the specifics. However, it relates very well with the topic that we discussed in the first trend, how digitization and AI can be linked together. The reality is that internet penetration, especially among the younger generation, is really, really high. ChatGPT users, Latin America leading that rate in that specific category. So how education can be used, or how education can leverage artificial intelligence digitization, is probably the next frontier, because we in Latin America live in an economy that is divided in two. So we have these high class neighborhoods and the low class neighborhoods, and the levels of education vary, the levels of interaction, opportunities vary a lot. So digitization and artificial intelligence will level the playing field between the rich and the poor. And I think that's, just to complement what I said about productivity, that's what's going to bring the boost in productivity when we think about Latin America. That's the massive potential opportunity that we will have in the next 5 years, how we can improve productivity through digitization and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I think we have 83% internet penetration in Mexico, and that number should go up to 90% by 2026. So we're talking about like 12 million people in Mexico alone that will be accessing the internet for the first time within the next 2-3 years. So that's gonna be a huge potential on digitalization, like Diego said.
All right. Thank you so much, Cesar. So Adrian has a question now to take us into the direction of energy, and he's explaining that he works in renewable energy distribution for residential and commercial markets. What's held the market back compared to the United States is the availability of financing programs in certain countries. So he's asking do you think this will change, and what do you think the demand will be for residential solar?
Well, thank you, Adrian. Look, there's two factors here. Number one is, particularly in solar, but also in wind energy, is the lack of clear regulations that govern that. And so that is being, particularly on the storage side, that is being a real impediment to investment. In terms of building solar farms and wind farms, the average time that it takes to approve a project in the United States, Western Europe, India, and China is about 2 years. In Mexico, it's closer to 7 years. In some Latin American countries, it's as little as 3 years, but on average, it's closer to 4.5, 5 years. So part of it is the fact that you have to go around to so many different government entities to get those permits rather than a one window sort of spot. Now, some governments are beginning to turn the corner on this, and they understand that they have to simplify that process, concentrate that process under one regulatory body, but that's still not happening. The other is the fact that if you're in the business of investing in generation, selling equipment, etc., Latin America, it's exciting. The growth rates are exciting, but it's from a tiny base, and there's just so much more going on in China, Western Europe, and the United States. And in all three of those markets, a big part of what's driving it is government subsidization or government investment. And so the projects are bigger, the money's on the table, there's a lot more incentives, there's a lot less political risk. If you're looking at a project that's going to generate you 7 or 8% return on investment, you can do that in a relatively low risk environment in Latin America when the cost of capital is 1%. But when the cost of capital as it is today in dollars is closer to 6%, then an 8% return on investment is not that exciting. And so you're not willing to stomach the political risk that comes and those kinds of delays that comes with Latin America. So Latin America, what can it do? It needs to governments really need, and we did some really interesting work for the IDB on this, where we looked at how these governments can streamline their regulations. So that's the first thing they can do. But they can't really afford to subsidize the creation of this industry the way the Americans, the Chinese, and the Europeans have. What they can do is stop subsidizing their conventional energy sectors. Latin American countries spend billions of dollars every year subsidizing the cost of gasoline, which is basically a handout to the middle class. But it is a disincentive for the renewable energy sector. And the other thing they can really do is invest in transmission. There's no sense investing in a solar farm if it's inefficient how that electricity is transmitted to the users. And so that's where governments can make a difference.
I want to add a critical point there, and it's the fact that climate change is impacting rain levels across Latin America. And when Brazil, Colombia rely heavily on hydropower, that becomes a game changer. And now with the massive wildfires that Brazil is going through, Argentina, Colombia, the region is cannot rely anymore on hydropower. I remember 10 years ago, Latin America was one of the leading regions when it came to implementing hydropower plants. And now climate change is forcing governments to actually go back and use thermal power plants, or they need to invest in solar electricity as an alternative to generate new electricity, especially for the residential segment. So I think that's going to be a game changer in the next year. And everyone knows what I'm talking about in terms of those massive wildfires in South America.
All right, thank you, Diego. Well, while we're still on the subject of energy, Juan also posed a related energy question that I thought was kind of interesting. So he observed about how we were talking about how there's going to be an energy spike with the data centers and things like that are anticipated for AI. So he notes that Microsoft just announced the use of nuclear energy for their data center, and he would like to know, do we see that happening in Latin America?
It's a good question. I think, first of all, nuclear power is vulnerable to seismic activity, and there's so many countries in Latin America that have considerable seismic activity, essentially the entire west coast of South America, up through Central America and into Mexico. So there's a certain number of countries that are off the table. The only country that seriously embraced the possibility of atomic power are two, Brazil and Argentina. And I think that for now, both countries have had recent discoveries of conventional energy. Both countries are moving forward with very interesting renewable energy. So I don't know that nuclear will be embraced as likely as it would be embraced by energy deficient countries like China, or countries with a long history of nuclear like France. So I wouldn't bet on it. I did want to take this moment to answer Cesar Velasco's question about Mexico and how the new government will deal with the mining industry, because I think that's an area that's of interest to several clients of ours. The AMLO administration went through kind of a transformation. And it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but a lot of what drove AMLO's policymaking, particularly in the first 3 years of his administration, was really a personal grudge. And he had a personal grudge against the 10 of the wealthiest men in Mexico who had financed the PR campaign against him to the tune of about $100 million when he lost a very contested election 12 years prior. And three of those backers of that financing were the three biggest Mexican-owned mining companies. And so he really went after the mining industry. But then he began to realize that he needs these guys. He needs these guys because they have investments that can't be moved offshore, and they generate a lot of tax revenue as well as export revenue. And so he kind of came around, and sort of alliances of chance or of aligned destinies were formed with the biggest mining companies. But there's still a lot of people within the marine industry that are anti-mining for sort of traditional environmental reasons. One area that I think we could see a reversal on a really dumb policy, and that is Mexico's decision to sort of nationalize its lithium industry and prevent foreign companies from investing in lithium. I say it's a dumb policy because Mexico by no means has a monopoly on lithium. The fact is that the Australians and the Chileans and soon the Argentines dominate lithium, and the world doesn't need Mexico lithium deposits. So if Mexico wants to develop its lithium deposits, they're going to have to invite miners to come do it. Mexico does not have a national mining company. They don't have the expertise to launch a national mining company. And so I think that's a policy, because Sheinbaum is much more in favor of energy transition. And she knows that lithium is one of the ingredients of that. So she wants to benefit from that as she sort of encourages CFE to invest with foreign investors in energy transition, in solar and wind, in data, in energy storage, and in transmission. And I think you'll see, it'll take a while. It might take it to a couple of years, but I think you'll see a loosening of or a reversal of this policy. That would be the one bet I would make.
All righty. Thank you, Zan. Let's zoom out a little bit. And as you can see, these questions are really running the gamut. Some of them are highly specific, some of them are broader. So we want to try to address as many as we can. I'm sure, though, with the panelists, that they have to be very nimble and keep adjusting here. But there's one I thought that was interesting to cover, considering the focus of the presentation. And that would be about from Carlos, which is about the current economic climate and projection for Latin America. What compelling narrative would you recommend in presenting to investors to highlight the region's potential opportunities?
I would say when you get the recording of this webinar in 3 days, go ahead and send that to them. No, but kidding aside, I think that there's two big narratives here. Number one is that the political scare that we all faced, or rather that 7 of the leading economies in Latin America faced 2 years ago. If you go back to October 2022, when people were planning their next year, you had 7 leftist populists running the 7 largest economies in Latin America, and investors were scared. Today, investors are less scared. Why? Because even though some of those leftist populists are in power, they've been reined in, they've been cordoned off by other opposing forces, whether it's politics, institutions, international trade agreements, economic reality, fiscal constraint. They've all sort of driven politics to something more centrist, something more pragmatic. So that is a reason for optimism. Another reason for optimism is some of the core opportunities that have been identified in this very presentation. Nearshoring. The nearshoring trend will continue. People will continue to divest from China, in part because of the political tensions of the United States, but also because of the rising cost of labor in China. And Latin America, particularly Mexico, is a natural place to move that to. The other is energy transition and what it means in terms of demand for minerals that are housed within Latin America, putting Latin America in an optimal position to capture more foreign direct investment and generate more export income. Then this demographic shift and the still continued growth in disposable income and disposable spending that drives that. And then, of course, in our payments practice, the whole digitization and what that means to bring in the unbanked and the informal economy that has operated in the shadows, in cash for generations, now operating in a more formal environment, a taxable environment, an environment that leads to money staying in the country and being invested in formal businesses. Those are all four positive trends that I think bode well for the region. There's still lots of risks, but those are definitely four opportunities. I don't know if my colleagues want to chime in with other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you hit very good points, Joe. I think in terms of e-commerce, I think is even when we compare to other regions, Latin America, it's still smaller than other regions, but it's definitely the region that it's growing faster. We do grow 21% CAGR from now up to 2026, 2027. So there is a tremendous potential when we talk about e-commerce, internet penetration, and financial inclusion. I think those three factors are very pushing the region forward in that sense.
And last point, a ample labor pool. We have lots and lots of workers, and as John pointed out, low wages are all over the place in the majority of the countries, with some exceptions, Chile or Costa Rica, but you find really low labor cost across Latin America. And digitization is leveling the playing field, and I'm sure it will increase productivity. So the combination of those factors create tremendous opportunities for Latin America.
All righty. So we have a couple of questions there now that are focused on the generational trends that we were observing. That was sort of our trend 5. So one is from Pedro that's talking about the boomers. So he's asking if we think that the consumer profile for the boomers is rapidly changing, and if they're adopting a similar profile as that of Gen Z. I guess from a consumption standpoint, I'm not sure of what you guys feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say a similar consumption profile, but it's definitely a generation that it's getting more familiar with digital as a whole. I think that has been pushed by social media, has been pushed by messaging apps, all those things. So it is definitely, I think, mixed across like all those different countries, all the different income levels. But I think it is a generation that is getting more digitized. It is a generation that it's getting more savvy around different brands, options, purchase options, and those kind of things. But it is very different than the Generation Z in terms of loyalty, right? I think for the Generation Z, I think opening, like buying a new product or closing an account, it's basically installing an app or deleting the app, which is very different than how the boomers see the relationship, consumer versus company versus the brand.
All right, thanks, I said. So Paula has a related generational question, but this one is a deeper dive into Gen Z. So her question is, can you dig a bit deeper on how Gen Z is considered to be financially literate or investors? I guess maybe investment oriented is what she may mean. She says she finds this difficult to see it herself because of the crazy amount of money that they spend in concerts and trips, especially considering Latin America's salary. So I'm not sure if you guys have explored it to that depth to be able to offer her an answer in this regard.
It reminds me of a quote I saw, I read a little while ago that said something like, today's youth, they're so irresponsible, they're so irreverent, they're nothing like we were. And it turns out it was written in 300 BC. The point is that it's and I imagine Paula is a parent at this stage if she's making a comment like that. the worst judges of how young people behave and how their behavior might be different in generations past is to ask their parents. The fact is that the Gen Z generation went through COVID, was marked by COVID, and the uncertainty that COVID generates for them. And so as a result, at least as their behavior stands today, they are saving at greater levels than the generations before them. In fact, you have to go back almost to the boomers to find a generation that saved as much as them. Boomers, of course, in Latin America also faced great uncertainty back in the 80s and early 90s through heavy debt, heavy devaluations, transformation of economy. So there's definitely a beyond the adoption of technology, the disloyalty to brands, their ability to try new things, they're actually pretty savvy investors. To invest in Latin America for a person to have a personal portfolio was something that only the most affluent were able to do in the past. Now, through all these investment platforms, a much bigger percentage of the population can do it. But the people who are really adopting that are young people, and they're interested in it. They're interested not just in the crazy stuff like crypto, but in, publicly traded companies and other types of assets. And that is a level of interest that we have not seen with young people before. It's partly a function of these changing investment models and platforms, but is also a function of their fear of uncertainty.
To complement John, to complement John very quickly, this week I received an email by Rappi in which they are promoting their new banking account, and the majority of users of Rappi in Latin America could be considering the Gen Z and millennial generations. And they are promoting this banking account by saying that the interest rate on that banking account is 15%. So they're tapping into this opportunity of younger generations looking to save, looking to invest. But the reality is that the education gap in Latin America versus other emerging markets is huge. So just think about the impact that the pandemic had in many of the emerging markets. The schools and universities probably were shut down 90 to 95 days on average. But when you look at Latin America, the average number of days that schools and universities were closed, it was 160. So you get this massive gap in terms of education, in terms of financial literacy, that is for sure impacting the region, but opportunities are rising.
And I think it's important to highlight also that the level of debt that someone at a young age has in the US, it's much different than in Latin America, right? And I wouldn't say this is because of a cultural difference. It's mainly because there are no many companies in Latin America that will actually extend a clean credit line to a young individual, right? So I think it's when you leave college in the US and you get off college with a huge debt, that's relatively different than in Latin America, because if you don't have the credit line, it's very hard to get a credit line to go to college. Just as a small comment there, but I think that makes a big difference.
Right.
All righty. So shifting gears a second, going back to the fourth trend. The fourth trend was talking about the hero companies and sort of the resilience of these unicorns and these small startups that managed to hang in there in Latin America despite some of the difficult times with COVID. So this anonymous attendee posed a very specific question about that, which was how this fourth trend with these local hero companies will impact consumers. And I'm not sure how the panel feels about that, if they see any impact there.
Yeah, I can take that. So I think there's a distinction among like the stars, right? Let's say the three largest tech companies in the region: Nubank, iFood, Mercado Libre. So they like those companies are very, very famous and popular with the population and the consumers in general. So I think though this is kind of like a winner takes all situation where those companies are in a very good position. Then you have like the companies that were able to become profitable and they keep growing throughout the crisis. And those are also companies that are gaining market share. Some of them are getting ready for a potential IPO. So I think this is a very selective group of companies. But I think the major impact is that, we're going to see huge consolidation. And with that, we're going to see less competition. We're going to see less options for the consumer as a whole, right? Not to say that new companies will eventually enter the market. So this number will keep growing because entrepreneurship is still on the rise. But what I foresee for the next 1 or 2 years, it's going to be perhaps more concentration within those large tech companies that I think that cannot even be called startups anymore, right? Because they just become so large.
Okay, thanks. I said, so to now, as I said, these questions do run the gamut. So now we have something a little bit more focused on the BRIC companies. So here it's talking. Adam is pointing out that the BRIC expansion is going to continue, and there's more members joining, and that the trade has expanded rapidly, particularly between Russia and Brazil, especially with fertilizer and diesel fuels, which is driven partially by the Western sanctions given the war in Ukraine. So his specific question with all that background is how are the BRICS expansion and Brazil's growing trade with Russia and China impacting Latin American economies?
I'll tackle that. I think Adam has put up a rhetorical question. I say that because nobody understands Russian international money flows and mindset in this part of the world better than Adam does. But Adam, I think, there's a big distinction between what drives Russian involvement in Latin America commercially versus that of China. China, there's a strategy. China, there are state-owned enterprises that are following a playbook, whether it's the pursuit of natural resources, whether it's the pursuit of markets for middle-income markets for its branded products, whether it's the expansion of its digital economy, private companies operating its digital economy. Russia is much more, I would say half of the recent involvement or uptick in Russian involvement in Latin America is really driven by the need of private companies in Russia to avoid the outreach of the Russian government, whether it's sanctions or whether it's trying to get money out of Russia. And worries about the Russian economic situation. So very different motivations, very different scale. The scale of Russian commercial involvement in Latin America is quite small. The scale of Chinese involvement is huge. Now, the BRICS recently were seriously considering involving Venezuela as a member. And interestingly enough, even though Lula came out sort of at best neutral, if not supportive of Maduro following his electoral fraud, Brazil, it is speculated that they pressured or they brought to light the potential embarrassment of having Venezuela in the BRICS and therefore convinced the Chinese and Indians to vote against that. So I think that the expansion of BRICS will certainly not include Venezuela. I'm not sure which other countries in Latin America are under consideration. I'm not a big believer in the power of BRICS. I think it's really more of a charade than anything serious, especially when it comes to forming their own currency. I think that's nothing to be taken seriously. A Chinese currency that becomes adopted in international reserves and is traded more is a real threat to US dollar domination, but not a BRIC currency. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you, John. So shifting gears once again, an anonymous attendee brings up a question about the B2B market and what are the trends and insights for the technology sector. That's a bit broad, but I'm not sure if the panel feels up to tackling that.
Yeah, I can tackle that question. B2B right now is going through a massive change, especially when you think about technology and the use of technologies that facilitate transactions, reduce costs, and improve productivity. So when you think about B2B on the logistics space, on the energy space, on the manufacturing space, technologies that reduce cost and improve efficiencies are actually the ones coming on top. So a great example of how technology is used in the B2B space in Latin America is new ports. So new ports is this disruptive freight forwarder that came out of Mexico, and it became a unicorn, I think in 2023. So it had massive success because of the use of technology in a very outdated sector like the freight forwarding space, in which you had to call up your ocean carrier or your air freight provider to understand what were the rates. With Newport, basically you go online and you quote your shipment, and it became massively disruptive for the sector in Latin America. So that's one key specific example. Another one is the use of technology to become more efficient in manufacturing operations, how you can lower your operational cost with the use of the Internet of Things. That type of disruption is basically driving the adoption of new technologies. So it's not the fact about just implementing technology or implementing artificial intelligence for the sake of doing it, because it's really expensive. And when you look at the B2B space, technology is massively implemented only by the large corporations in the region. So there's going to be a massive gap between large and small and medium businesses, because the small and medium businesses, they don't have the resources to implement massive technological solutions. So now we may see in the next decade a greater divide between the large corporations and the SMEs, and that's probably going to be a risk if technology providers are not able to lower the costs of some of the solutions that they are offering in the marketplace. That's going to be the key takeaway in Latin America.
Okay, thanks so much, Diego. So let's wrap it up now with our final question that we still have on the board here. And this is back to Mexico again. So this is an anonymous attendee who is posing the question: how do they view the impact that AMLO's policies can have on nearshoring and short sea routes in Latin America?
Come again, Abel, can you repeat the question?
Sure.
I
How
lost
do
you for
they
a
view
second.
the impact that AMLO's policies can have on nearshoring and short sea routes in Latin America?
Well, for me, AMLO's policies during the last 2 months have been very detrimental to nearshoring. So in the last week of his government, basically he expropriated a port owned by a U.S. company in the Gulf of Mexico near Cancun, and that creates severe precedent. He did something similar with Iberdrola and its power plants. So his policies have only discouraged investment. And that's my main concern, because Mexico is fumbling the ball when it comes to the policies to attract companies. The blessing is that Mexico is just south of the border to the US. Otherwise, forget about it. Companies won't be thinking about investing in Mexico because of those aggressive policies. Now we might see a change in the rhetoric. I think Sheinbaum is more pragmatic, and that will help to reduce the risks, but the damage has been done. The damage has been done. And my key takeaway is that in the case of short sea routes, I have seen a 50% increase, for instance, in imports in the South Florida area coming from Mexico. And that's basically short sea route of companies looking to use ports to then move goods to the US through South Florida and then reach consumers on the Northeast. So there's lots of potential to short sea routes, not only in Mexico, but Central America, the Caribbean. However, in some of the smaller markets in the Caribbean, the demand or the volumes are so small, and that happens as well in the Gulf of Mexico with the US coast and Gulf port strikes. Mexican ports were not even considered by many companies to be used as an alternative because of the outdated infrastructure, the poor systems in place to handle imports. So the reality is that Mexico has done very little in terms of investing in infrastructure to accommodate the massive wave of companies that are looking for alternatives. So I don't know, John, what you can add about it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And the problem is not just on the port side or even logistical infrastructure, but also energy. You know, by by intervening in the energy markets in the name of protecting CFE and Pemex, the two state-owned energy players in Mexico, he essentially dissuaded over $40 billion of investment that was earmarked for solar farms and for other areas of energy generation that was coming from independent, privately held. And why was those dissuaded? Because those new sources of energy would have been cheaper and cleaner than anything CFE could produce, and therefore a threat to CFE, their jobs, and their ability to generate revenue for the Mexican government. So I do believe that those energy policies to some degree will be shifted or changed, or if not reversed, under Sheinbaum. But that what is done, by people that we know who operate in commercial real estate in Mexico, they tell us that several clients decided not to invest in Mexico, but instead take their nearshoring to Vietnam or Bangladesh or Turkey, because they did not feel that they would have a reliable electricity supplied to them. And so that has had a material impact on Mexico's attractiveness as a nearshoring destination.
Okay, thanks so much, John. Well, I think that wraps us up for the questions. So if the attendees, of course, have any other further questions, here you have all our contact information. You can reach out to any of the panelists to sort of take the discussion further. And I think that just about does it for us. Of course, you can see a QR code there with any other thought leadership from our company that you'd like to read. And you, of course, are welcome to visit our website for further stuff in the insight section, americasmi.com. There's a bunch of different reports and, of course, blog posts and things of that nature. And, of course, this particular forecast will be distributed, both the presentation and the webinar, to the audience, and we'll also probably publish a blog post separately, which will have the same materials, but it'll be a bit more of a summary, so some of the recapping some of the basic points. But I think that just about does it for us. So I think that we've stayed over our time. Thank you so much for staying and staying along with us up to this point. But I think we're going to be signing off now, so you guys can get on with the rest of your day, and so can we. So thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you can join us at any our future events in the near future. Thanks so much and have a great day.